This is part 2 of a podcast interview with me, Darwin Grosse. It was a cool thing, but really it was Grant, and then by extension, Grant, once the internet started coming into play, we got to know some people in the area, particularly people down in Chicago like Michael Furman, John Papiowski, these people who eventually formed this group MEME, the Midwest Electronic Music Ensemble. And we would play together, but we'd also hang out together and talk smart about stuff, right? And then we got to know Andre Stroder, which is a composer that happened to be living in Milwaukee at the time. He would work with us and record with us a little bit. A phenomenally talented and absolute bastard of a man. But he was an incredible person, and all these people just kept on, like on a weekly basis, like whole universes would get unlocked for me. It was fantastic. And that was really, that combined with that opening of my mind, combined with the fact that I was, I had started when I was in northern Wisconsin, but really once I moved to Milwaukee is when I really honed my technical skills, programming skills, and really got to be quite a good programmer. And then I had a job. I had this one job that was just horrible. So I started trying to find other things to do, things related to music or electronic music in particular, that I could do to at least make a little money. And one of the first ones, well, even before trying to make money, what I wanted to do is I wanted to just get my name out there. And luckily this new thing called the internet was starting to get popular. And I was really into both analog and digital gear. And so one of the things I got was one of my first really high-end-ish keyboards that I purchased after the ESQ1 was this PV keyboard called the DPM 1 or DPM 3. The DPM was a really peculiar thing because it had both wavetable samples, but you could also load in your own samples, and it had a very sophisticated and good sounding audio engine. And I liked it. I liked it because I could do a lot of composition on this thing because it was multi-timbral and it did a pretty good job of it. And I actually was doing I did a film score for a commercial or for like a training video and stuff like that, just using the DPM and Cakewalk. But eventually I was like, I wanted something more, and then I started seeing the ads for this new Kurzweil K2000. So I worked with the local music store. I was like, the second one comes in, I'll buy it. And so one came in, and I found a credit card with enough room on it, and I threw the credit card at the guys, and I took home my Kurzweil K2000, and I just ran into the most incredible sonic environment I'd ever worked with, right? Oh yeah, you're still there. Okay.
No, sorry. No,
that's great.
Sorry. The thing you can't hear, since I have headphones on, is you can't hear all these shoes dropping. I know. Okay. Look, I know you don't like to talk about yourself, but what's been really interesting about this is if you stitch all this together, there's a whole bunch of stuff about you that suddenly makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah. Well, with the DPM3, one of the things I had done was I knew programming well enough that I made a DOS editor for the DPM3. And I got to know the people at PV, and they let me put an ad in their little users newsletter. And so I got to know people all over America, all over the world, really, who would send me $35, and I'd send them a disc, and then we'd talk about the DPM, right? But I get this Kurzweil, and simultaneous to that, this internet thing is cropping up. And, I started to get to know people on the internet through lists like the eMusic L list and the Synth L list. And that's how I got to know Mike Metley and Nick Rothwell and all these people. But also there was a list got started for the Kurzweil K2000. So I'm like, let's rock on. So I get on there, and unfortunately it's like I'm watching this, and the list is like, well, I really like preset 221 a lot better than 223 because the reverb's down a little bit, and so it's a better sound, right? And I'm like, oh, come on, man, you can do better than this. Because I was like on this list about analog gear that Grant and those people had turned me on to, and there, people are like, yeah, the resonance at 72% is just perfect on the Oberheim OB8, but if you do that same thing on an OBX, it sounds terrible, right? So they would get into these incredible levels of detail that I just ate up, right? I get on this Kurzweil thing, and it's like, I'm really having trouble fitting this into my church band or whatever. So I was like, this thing has got the most incredible synth engine since ever. So I'm going to start doing something about it. So I started off by writing an article that was basically, I wrote an article for the list that was like, you know what? You need to be able to program your own sounds. So let's start off with a 2 oscillator, 1 filter, VCA voice with an envelope. Okay? Now, what happens if we modulate the envelope? Now, what happens if we modulate the VCA? Now, what happens if we put a different oscillator in? Or we try a different waveform? And I did this series of like 20 posts that were outrageous. They were phenomenal, phenomenally successful. I mean, people would just ask questions, and all of a sudden, people from all over the world are contacting me and be like, oh, that's really great. I so much appreciate it. Let me send you an album that I did based off of the stuff you did. I mean, still to this day, especially if I'm in Europe, I notice this whenever I go to the music messe. There are people there that when they see my badge as Darwin Grosse, they're like, oh, everything I do today is because I learned your programming tutorials, right? So I wrote these tutorials.
Well, that's how I first encountered you.
Oh, really? The Kurzweil tutorials?
Absolutely.
Oh, unreal.
Absolutely. Not just that. The thing that was really interesting about them was they were really well written, and they assumed you didn't know. They didn't assume that you didn't know anything,
right?
And they basically like walked you through something. And frankly, tutorials in those days were often associated with very, very different things than that. They weren't oriented necessarily toward discovery as they were a very narrow set of goals.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, because when I think of what, like Keyboard Magazine would have, like, we'll teach you to play like, to do this lick from a Toto album, right? And that was the goal. The goal was to emulate something like that. And my thing was like, you have this incredible engine. You need to understand what you have under your fingers so that you don't spend your time choosing between presets 221 and 223. Right.
There's no reason in the world you couldn't be making the presets.
Right, exactly. And that really kind of blew up. I got to know a lot of people. I got to know certainly a lot of people that were artists that were using, and I would get emails from just people that I couldn't believe they were emailing me. I mean, and some of them are funny. I mean, I remember when Constance Darby sent me a note and offered to send me an album and stuff. And I was like, I can't believe Constance Darby, New Age star, is offering to send me a CD. That was fantastic. It blew me away. But also, I got to know Chuck Chirac at Sweetwater, who was just a fabulous supporter of the community at the time. I mean, he put together some contests in the Kurzweil community that got a lot of people excited about doing interesting and new work, and built a lot of presets for people to be able to share. And that was really great. But also at the time, I was going through my wife, so I was married a second time by then to the woman who's my current wife, and who was always super supportive of all of this stuff. It was really amazing. But she was at the time working in Japan for a year, so I was living in the States by myself. So taking on a project like, I'm going to teach the world to program a Kurzweil K2000 seemed perfectly in order, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some task to fill your time.
Right, but also I kind of ran into a buzzsaw with my ex-wife. That was a huge financial hit, and it caused me to have to sell all of my gear. all of the gear I had accumulated to that point I had to sell, which I did. And then I had to write this kind of sad note to the Kurzweil list saying, due to these financial difficulties, I'm afraid I'm going to have to step aside now. And I was like, it's going to be just too painful to follow the list, so I'm going to sign out, right? And I did. And, I got tons of condolence letters, and people were so sweet about it. But also, I started getting $50 checks. So people had decided that this is really unfortunate and that I had helped them. So they decided to, as a group, whoever was able to should just send me a check. So they had gotten my address, and I just started getting these checks. Some of them for $50, some of them for a lot more. And it allowed me to buy a Kurzweil, what at the time was the top of the line machine, a Kurzweil K2VX, which I still have.
Wow, that's a step. That's kind of a step. Well, when we talk about the internet, there's this thing that we keep talking about, and that is it lets us extend our interests beyond our little narrow circle of light. And the other part of it is you can never tell where what you do is going to land.
Well, right. I had never really understood. It was kind of interesting for me to think about, well, I can talk to people on Analog Heaven, and now I don't have to move to London or to San Francisco in order to be surrounded by synth heads, right? Or like in the K2000 thing, I can talk to people about this incredible sound engine, and I don't have to be employed by someone in order to do it. I have the mechanism. I don't have to be a keyboard writer or a manual writer for Kurzweil in order to be able to talk and share this kind of stuff. And I just didn't recognize how wide of a throw that had. That threw me for a real loop. I didn't understand or get that was how big this was, right? So
yeah, well, part of it is you got there one little step at a time. So it must have been really overwhelming to suddenly, you know what I mean? It's suddenly like, we think of it in terms of electricity. The spark leaps across the gap.
Right. Yeah.
And the last thing you were expecting was this spark to, to have something show up in your mailbox like that. Or Constant Denby sends you tapes.
Yeah, right? Exactly so. And so, that was real wonderful. And then Chuck again offered to help. He gave me an opportunity to do some programming work for him and stuff like that. And all this stuff really kind of helped me get back on my feet. And I kind of got back into recording again, and this is when things were really starting to move with my interaction with Grant and stuff like that. That was really great. But because of those Kurzweil tutorial things, this guy Mike Metley writes me a note, and he's like, I see you around the eMusic L and Synth L things, but someone just laid these Kurzweil things on, and they're really incredible, and do you want to write? I just got this new job with Recording Magazine. Do you want to write for Recording Magazine? I was like, hell yeah, that sounds like fun. And so he starts sending me gear, and I start doing reviews. To this date, I've done almost, I think it's getting close to 150 articles for Recording Magazine.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And, that was a really neat door that swung open. And then, because of the Kurzweil tutorials and the fact that I just started writing for Recording Magazine, one of the first things I reviewed was Native Instruments Generator, which was the precursor to Reactor.
Yes, that's right.
And I wrote about it and gave a very detailed and well, because my experience now included all this stuff with Buchlas and Aries and Moogs and Surges. So I knew my modular stuff cold, right? So I could talk about what they were providing with a real sense of understanding. So they got in touch with me and they're like, we're having trouble with this manual thing. Can you help us out? And so I actually worked on a rewrite that never got issued of the Reactor manual. But then they decided they wanted to put out a Prophet 5 emulator called the Pro 5. And they asked if I would write the manual for it. So I did. And it was phenomenally successful. So then they came out with this thing called the the B4, which was an organ plugin, also did phenomenal. I wrote the manual for that. And then Battery came out, and I wrote the manual for that. And, I was kind of doing their manuals and stuff. And then, but I liked all that software, but I was really kind of into Macs. And that was when I was a Macs beta tester for early version of Pluggo. And I would talk to David Ziccarelli a lot because, by this time I was running a business that did business database software. So we could talk about business being business, but I could also talk about, what I thought, could help Macs and what I thought could help Pluggo and stuff like that. And I had this was before I actually this is after so I sold this company. I didn't get very much for it. But then I got this job. It was a horrible, horrible job working at a place I won't name in Milwaukee. But there was a person who was there who had a very bad. It was just a bad environment. He provided a bad environment to work in. I couldn't stand it. And David has always maintained this part of his website where it's in some way says, if you're incredibly good at what you do and you want to be incredibly underpaid, let me know, right? And so I was like, well, at this point in time, being underpaid for something that didn't make me sick every day had to be a good thing. So I called him up and I said, hey, you're working on this Pluggo thing. You've got other things. I've been doing this documentation stuff. I've been doing these reviews. How about you let me work for you? So he said, sure. And I started my first job was doing a rework of a bunch of the SDK manual. And from there, then it just kind of exploded. I did the cell block object. I did some debugging work. I did some fix-its here and there. Eventually got to be the head of engineering, and then spun off and have been working on educational and documentational information since. So that's how I got to where I am today.
And
crazy ride. Huh?
I was going to say, what were the phrase? What a long, strange trip it's been.
I'm telling you. Well, and it's funny because I actually, once I started working at Cycle 74, I'd always one of the things that happens when you're in these heavily religious backgrounds growing up is you tend to not have great educational backgrounds. I had crap for education, so I actually, once I started at cycling, I went back to school and I got both my bachelor's and master's. And subsequently now I am teaching at the University of Denver. I teach one class every quarter. But one of the things a lot of students will ask me is like, how do I get a job like yours? And I was like, man, all I can tell you is, I got my job because I happened to be willing to write a tutorial at the beginning of the World Wide Web. That's how I got my job. I don't know how you're going to get yours.
Well, I mean, that's a real problem. We have this notion that I don't really, for most of us, when we think about finding our artistic voice or things like that, we tend to think of it as we describe it to people as being really individual, right? Because we're artists, that's how we're supposed to think of ourselves. But somehow or other, when it comes to doing things like work, we suddenly fall back on this idea of credential and expertise and stuff like that. And it ceases being an entirely personal thing and turns into this set of boxes that we have to check off.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that strikes me about this is it is true that some of that's about being in the right place at the right time. And having talked to you about this now, you can link that little line of shadowy tracks in the snow back to the cabin you left. Right. You know what I mean? Right. You can sort of do that, but it's not something that's going to translate into a narrative for somebody else.
Right. It doesn't turn into a path to a career. That's right. Now, one of the things I would say is that I think the current generation is really lucky in comparison to my generation in terms of the barrier to entry. So one of the things I would say is that when I got started, I mean, I actually had an entrepreneurial flair. I started companies, so, and certainly when I started this database company, one of the things I thought about is how to start a company doing music software, right? But first of all, it was very hard to make a computer do this kind of stuff. I mean, when you look at the annals, now we look at the annals of these people struggling to make computer music, and we're like, what could possibly have been so hard? All you had to have was idea, right? But back then, literally, you were hand wiring cards so that when you flipped certain registers, they would make a click, and then you would string enough clicks together to make a sound, and then you would hope that you could get a computer that would run fast enough to make a sound for a second.
It's so easy to hear that story and to think of it as being quaint rather than the way that things are. The music that came out of that was integrally related to something having to do with what you think of as the quaint part of the story.
Well, one of the things I would say is that to a certain extent, this just shows how powerful music is, because it was an epic struggle to get a damn computer to make sound, right? And the fact that people stuck with it through the hellacious trials that they had to do in order to pull it off is amazing to me, because it just shows the level of will that people had behind finding a way to make music using these new devices. I think there was a certain sense to which if we can do it, it's going to be amazing, and so that's why we should do it. But the efforts that it took to do that. I had an experience when I was at North Texas. They were trying to make an ear training course to run on a computer so that, they could have people practice ear training without having to have an instructor in the room. And, we were hand wiring boards for a P2P 11780, which was the size of several refrigerators. And
that's a great big box.
Yeah, and that was the mechanism by which having something go beep that represented a middle C was done. It was outlandish. But again, people with much more vision than me were looking at that and saying, "Man, if we get this to work, it's going to be amazing." So
there's also the sense, though, in which constraint focuses your activity in ways that's not the case now. We don't really want to get into one of those you kids today have no idea how good you've got it things, but I want to turn that around and to say one of the interesting things about that activity is that there's a real sense in which being able to do anything gives you a much more frightening future than one which is more constrained by certain kinds of technological challenges. It's not as scary because you can't do everything.
Right, but now I would also balance that. I've heard that from other people talking about the availability of constraints, and I do it for myself. Lately, I've been using an Electron Octatrack, which in comparison to Ableton Live has incredibly tight constraints. But I do it because it puts me in a good artistic place. Now, the one thing I would say, though, is that a lot of the constraints were sort of like, they did not seem like an unvarnished win at the time, because unless you were of a certain mindset, it was very difficult to be satisfied with your work. Right? We're talking about a time when Glyn Johns is spending millions of dollars to make the ultimate album, or Becker and Fagan will spend, a decade crafting the perfect album. And I'm in my basement with an ESQ1, making 4 squeaky notes and then bouncing it down to a 2-track cassette. And trying to align those in some way was really difficult. And it was also difficult to say, to say, other than for pure kitsch factor, making a 4-track squeaky tone it didn't seem satisfying in some way. It didn't seem like I was doing the work that I was hearing in my head. And so I'm sure there were people for whom chiptune music was what they heard in their head. For me, chiptune music was a failure in comparison to what I had in my head.
I see.
And so I couldn't be satisfied with chiptune music, even though
Huh.
I was making it.
Interesting. So maybe part of that question has to do, and you've alluded to this along the way, this notion about how it is, since you started out doing stuff by yourself. I guess I have a sort of a question for you about how do you think you came to learning to trust yourself?
I would say I don't. I mean, one of the reasons I have very little released material is because I never trust myself to come up with an end product.
Ah,
I have hours and hours and hours of recorded material, which will never hear the light of day because either I've moved on and I don't even want to go through the editing process of that,
mm-hmm.
or my recollection of it was, and this is the funny one. My recollection of it was that it sounded like shit. And then if I do go back and listen to it, I'm like, oh man, that was surprisingly awesome, right?
Yeah.
But at the time, it didn't feel like whatever epic I had in my head at the time, and so there you go. And so what I find is actually, I really work best in two modes. One is live performance because I'm just like shooting it out there, and I never have to think about it again, right?
Ah, of course.
Or the other thing is working in collaboration or working on other people's material. It's why I'm always much more, I've been doing mastering engineering for quite some time. I worked with a number of labels over the years as their mastering engineer. And one of the things I loved about it is it wasn't my stuff. So all I had to do was make it as good as it was going to sound. And it wasn't my responsibility for either the content or the quality. I just had to make it as good as it could be.
Well, I can't really say I've had any complaints with your work so far, just personally.
Well, there you go.
Sorry, a disclaimer is in order here. Darwin has mastered pretty much everything I think I've commercially released just about and produced quite a lot of it as well.
Right. I do that, though, because I like the music that you do. I mean, now I'm in a lucky position. I have a great job, but I also have a family that's pretty demanding and stuff. So it's not like I'm going to sit around and do an extra 30 hours a week of mastering work, right?
Mm.
I only do mastering or production work of things that I enjoy doing. But there still is sort of like that built-in limit, which is like it's a whole lot more efficient if I'm working with somebody else's stuff because I can make decisions about your work. It's my work that I hate making decisions about.
Got it. Yeah, I guess I've been doing a little bit of remixing recently, and I think I have a sense of what you mean about that. It's less scary. You don't always have the sense that everything you do is derivative the moment you do it.
Right. Yeah, that's a big one. The other one is that hits me all the time because I do have a tendency to sort of like chase interests around. Is I'll do something and then 2 weeks later I discovered something else that in my mind is so much better than that previous thing I was doing. And so that builds in this kind of like cautionary story in your head, which is like, what if I do a thing that I'm embarrassed of?
Mm.
You know? And there again, sort of like the shaming systems of my youth come into full bloom as an adult.
Yeah, well, absolutely. We did. That is one of those things that does come back to, or who do you don't think you're anyone special?
Right.
One of my favorites.
Who do you think you are to, ... Right. Exactly.
Yeah, but what's really interesting about a lot of your discussion is that there's so many people who kind of came out of that background who I would think would somehow get this idea that great stuff or compelling stuff is always made by somebody with more stuff someplace you can't be.
I mean, there was a certain amount of that. There was a certain amount of saying, I can't make a good release because I don't have an excellent reverb, right? Or especially if you think of in terms of making a career out of it, I can't do this because I'm unwilling to live in LA, which for me was very much the case. I mean, I've had, in one way or another, most of my adult life, I have been responsible for at least one child, right?
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of places you don't live where if you have kids. LA is not a great kid living place, not the kind part of LA where you're going to be involved in music and recording, right? San Francisco, not a great place to be roaming around with kids, especially if you're doing that without a lot of money.
Yeah, I was going to say, unless you're independently wealthy, it's a
Right.
difficult place to
Yeah,
live,
and see, that's the
period.
thing. The independently wealthy thing is, I think, in a lot of cases, when people look at someone who's working in music or working in music software or whatever, there's almost an implication that, well, you come from a really privileged background. And I talk about my parents and this company that they run and stuff, and it could be easily construed to think that that's what it was, right? But also, I was, I think, a great disappointment to him, and so there was no flow of money into my pocket. I've been a working guy for most of my adult life, just because I've always had responsibilities, and so with those responsibilities come limits, and some of the limits are, I can't live in Manhattan, I can't live in San Francisco, and I can't live in LA, in the cool part of LA, because that's not conducive to this other part of my life I have to serve.
Mm. But you're lucky enough now to live in a world in which you have at least access to hear what's going on in those
Well,
places.
not only that, but I also have the ability to work for a company that's based out of San Francisco, and I live on the top of a mountain in Colorado. It's fabulous. But there again, I moved up here 12 years ago. 14 years ago, I wouldn't have believed such a thing was possible.
Hmm.
So I kind of push, I kind of ride at the front end of stuff. Now, also you ask some about like how it is I feel confident enough to do this. In a lot of cases, it wasn't a sense of confidence. It was just having kind of the balls to do it. This is particularly true when it came to the mastering thing. The reason that I got into mastering was because I had this job working for a company, and part of the job was that every year I could take between $1,000 and $1,500 and purchase some technological thing for my own use. So a lot of people would use it to continuously upgrade their computers or get one of the fancy pants new flat screen monitors or whatever. Well, one year I used it to get a one-speed CD-ROM burner,
Oh,
which nobody else in the world really had at the time, right? It was so rare. It cost, I think, $1,295. And I got that, and I got a copy of the software that DigiDesign made that allowed you to make an indexed CD. And then I called up my friend Mike Bentley, and I'm like, hey, I hear you're doing a CD, and I got a CD burner, and why don't we do something? And I talked to a bunch of people on Analog Heaven, and we were putting together this idea for an album, and I was like, well, I got the CD burner now, so send me all your stuff, and we'll make the first. It was called the Electronic Music Project, and it was, we sold a ton of those CDs, because it was just a bunch of people from the Analog Heaven list that did a CD. And, back at the time when nobody was able to put out personal CDs, I was able to do it. And so all of a sudden, all these CDs start floating around with my name on it as mastering and production engineer. And so then labels were sort of like, hey, I hear you do this stuff. Can you do it for us too? And by then, I had 5 or 6 of them under my belt. And I was like, and at the time too, man, an awful lot of CD pressings sounded horrible.
true
And
enough.
so there was a very low bar for me to beat. I could beat that easily enough because I at least had ears, right? I'd been doing audio work since I was 12, so
Yeah,
I felt
since
like
you're
I had
looking right,
ears,
since you're
right?
looking at the masking tape on the old
Exactly
Ford
right.
dial, sure,
Exactly
right?
right. So I felt like I had ears where a lot of other people just had software they were looking at, and so that's how I got into the mastering game. And, likewise, with the recording thing, I happen to have that Tascam 80-8 back when not everybody had them. And there was another guy with a big console and another guy with a room. And we were like, hey, let's pool our stuff and make a recording studio. And now all of a sudden I've put the crown of being a recording engineer on my head. Not through any purposeful route, but because I happen to have enough gear to get the job done, and I had the balls to say I'm willing to do it.
And to actually do the hard work.
And to do it, yeah, right. It took a lot of study, right. When I was working on being a recording engineer, I would spend 10 hours a day in a studio and another 8 hours a day at the university library pulling old copies of DB magazine and old recording thing. I mean, you'd get these books and they would basically show you, how how you would set up the wire recorder for a proper recording, right? It was ridiculous, but all of that stuff was elemental knowledge that I needed, and I would absorb it like a sponge.
So what are you sponging up now?
Well, I mean, I was really excited with the new version of analog gear. I helped Grant when Grant Richter gets his wired business started, and that was a really exciting time. That was cool, and I was just like really into the modular thing from then on. And so I got into it. Now, if I would go over my history of gear I've owned, I have this tendency to like really get into a thing and then own all of it, and then just get frustrated with having so much stuff and then purging. So I'm really a binge and purge kind of a guy with gear. Well, I kind of like really binged on getting a whole ton of analog electronic gear, and then just realized that I felt like I was just surrounded by too much stuff. So I pared down to a tiny little tip-top Station 252 case with the modules I really want in Eurorack format. I'm still playing around with like the last ultimate filter and the perfect LFO for me, but mostly it's a settled down system. But what I've kind of gotten into lately is the idea of interesting performance concepts and technologies. So, like I said, I'm a lot more comfortable with performance than like studio recording.
Mm-hmm.
But what that means is I feel like to be a good performer with whatever tool you're using, you have to practice. So I have this structure where I do daily practice on my modular synth, right? I kind of wanted to have a corollary to that for the sequencing and the rest of the performance rig. And so prior to that, I'd been using an Ableton Live system. I'm obviously very comfortable with Ableton Live and with Max for Live and all that stuff. But it was almost as if that was too comfortable and too closely related to what I do as work. When something is too close to work, then to me it ceases being art. And so I needed to sort of extract myself from my work environment in order to do my performing environment. So I started working with external hardware for doing this stuff. So I tried a bunch. I really got into loopers and looping technology. But the problem with looping is that all looping performances seem to have this same sort of like device, which is, okay, I'm starting now, here's my first loop, now I'm going to layer my second loop, now I'm going to layer my third loop, which is great the first time, the first thing you do. It's really tiresome the fourth time you do it. And I always try and be really honoring the people that are listening to my stuff. I'm sure they wouldn't think so, but I at least like to think that I'm trying to honor the fact that there's an audience in the room. And I felt like that was not really being. I wasn't bringing sufficient material to the table when I was just using a looper. So then I started working with different types of sequencers. I kind of went back, first of all, to some of my roots with the MPC series, thinking of that as sort of like a real-time system. But the problem with that is it has a relatively inefficient sampling workflow. So it wasn't really conducive to doing sampling live. It was great for doing prepared stuff or for sort of like setting the table with sounds and doing live performance of percussive material or recorded sampled material of whatever sort. To me, I was like, well, if I'm really going to make this part of the thing, I also want this live sampling kind of thing that a looper brings. So how can I sort of mix and match what I'm comfortable with on the MPC, but with what I'm also comfortable with the looper, and also how do I reduce the amount of crap that I have. So even as recently as in this August, I went for a little mini tour with my friend Mark Mosier. We played a couple of towns in the Midwest, and my rig at that point was my little modular, but then I had the Boss RC505 looper, which was as good of a looper as I could have hoped for, but it was just a looper. And then I had a Korg ESX drum machine sampler, which great for that percussive live thing, but also it didn't do real-time sampling in any way. And then I had to have a mixer and a reverb and all this kind of stuff. So I ended up with this like table full of stuff. And Mark Mosier goes out on tour, and he's got an Octatrack and a damn Blofeld desktop unit, nothing else. He's set up in 2 minutes. It takes me an hour and a half to get it all running. And I'm just like, eh. So I bought myself an Octatrack, and I'm in the process of learning how to integrate it into what I think of as performance.
So maybe it's a little bit early to expect a definitive answer to that, but how do you think of performance in that way?
Well, I would say this. One of the things that I've really come to understand with all of these systems, whether it's the MPC or the ESX or the loopers or whatever it is that the worst thing you can do is come to the table and say, I want to work like X, and this system has to follow me while I do that, right?
I see. So you're thinking it's more an emergent property, as it were.
Right. Well, and it's an opportunity for me to learn. The people who, Electron, when they put together the Octatrack, they weren't just stupidly making decisions. They would come to some fork in the road and say, well, in order to pursue what we want to pursue, we have to take this leg of the fork. Right?
Oh yeah, of course.
It's the same with the MPC. It was the same with the ESX or with the loopers. Every one of them has some decisions were made in the development of the device, and it's an opportunity for me to learn about the decision-making process that these people have done. Now, I would say that Electron is one of these peculiar companies where people seem to either just like totally get their stuff or be totally bollocksed by it. And I would say for the longest time, I was totally bollocksed by it. But the nice thing for me is that two things. First of all, I put myself in a position of having to use it. Secondly, I put myself in that position, but I didn't have to perform a Darwin Grosse set. So I was invited by my friend Wally, Mother Earth Sound System. They did a show way up in the mountains here in Colorado. It was a fabulous thing. You know, you drive for like an hour away from any humans, and there's like all of a sudden there's this camping spot with a PA and DJs spinning and all that kind of stuff, right? And so what I did was I took the Octatrack, but I said instead of doing my typical set, what I'm going to do is kind of do what I call an enhanced DJ set. So it's some of my compositions in raw form, and then some recorded material by other artists. So I focused on people who are on the Raster Noton label. Mm-hmm. And so it was a bunch of my work as a bunch of stems and little sequence bits and stuff that I would perform live, and then I would crossfade into this Raster Noton stuff. And it was a fabulous experience because, first of all, I didn't have to bring in my normal shtick. So I didn't even take the modular along. It was really a completely different thing. And so because I didn't have to bring along all my normal baggage, I was able to approach the device on its own, and it was phenomenal. And I learned a ton. I learned how to negotiate their manual, which I had printed, and I still, every day when I'm doing my practice now, I pick some other thing like, okay, today I'm going to work on the LFO designer and how to make that a part of what I do, right? And it just got to be part of my everyday practice routine. It's working out. It's becoming an instrument to me, which is really cool.
There's a lot to think about there, and so maybe when we get to podcast 200, we can kind of go back over this again, because this is an extended and astounding story. But I would be really amiss if I didn't stop for a second and say, as an example of an idea in practice or something like that, because there's a real practical aspect to what you're doing. Let's talk about the podcast itself.
Right. Sure. What do you want to know?
Why'd you do it?
Again, first of all, I didn't think anybody other than my coworkers would listen to it. So I didn't have any grand
Thanks for
ideas.
playing. Thanks for playing.
Right. But also, I had read this book called Trust Agents, and it was sort of like one of the things they kind of point to is the fact that if you put yourself out there, people start viewing you as some sort of like trusted person. And I was like, well, that sounds interesting, but I have no desire to get out there and become a trusted guy. But I do like some of the ideas that say, hey, talk to people and interview them and find out what they know and find out what they learned and all this kind of stuff. And so I was just like, and I hate my voice. I've always hated my voice. It's this northern Wisconsin thing where when I hear myself, it sounds like I just fell off the potato truck. And so
You're thinking of Up North Boy.
Up North Boy, yeah, one of my alter egos. I've always been uncomfortable with my voice, and so I thought, if I do this thing, if I just talk to people, and if I interview them and record it, and then just share it with like the people at work and stuff, I'll get used to working with my own voice, and maybe I'll get rid of some of the vocal tics I have. Now I still have some of them. Every time I edit an interview, the number of times I say, "Oh, that's interesting," is overwhelming.
Well, the
But
people that you talk to say interesting things.
that's what I was just going to say. What happened is something I couldn't have imagined. First of all, the first one I did, which was with Sam Tarkasian, I was really nervous, and I don't think he knew about it. And I don't think he cared whether I was nervous or not. He just thought it was a funny lark. And so I prepared this whole list of questions, and I would basically interrupt him mid-idea so that I could throw the next question at him. And I listened to it, and I was like, wow, that sounds very stilted, but I edited it down a lot, and I made it so it flowed a little better. And then the next one I did, which was with Dan Nygren, I also had a big list of questions, but he kind of threw me for a loop because he started talking about some of his background stuff, and it was in all of this analog heaven type stuff. And I kind of like jumped off the script because all of a sudden we're talking about stuff I was interested in, and I couldn't stop talking enough, and then next thing I know, our time was done, and I hadn't talked about my questions. When I'm editing it, it's like, wow, that was a lot better of an interview, right? And it was cool because Dan shared it with some of his friends, and now all of a sudden people outside of Cycling 74 were listening to this, and they're like, oh, that sounds good. You ought to talk to this person or that person. And so I started following some trails around, and it was really cool, and it was going along. I would get like 100 or 200 people listening to each podcast, and that was really neat. And then two things happened. First of all, I was supposed to do an interview with this guy who will never be interviewed because he, at the very last minute, he kept on delaying. And so, it was like Thursday, and I'm like, man, I got to get this in so I can get it edited and put out. And he's like, I'm really working on this thing. I have to do it. Can we do it on Friday? So I'm like, okay. And then Friday comes, oh, I can't do it. Can we do it on Saturday? Can we do it Saturday night? Can we do it Sunday morning? Finally, Sunday morning comes, and I always post Sunday by noon, right? Sunday morning comes, and he's like, yeah, I'm not going to do it. I'm like, well, thanks, man. Thanks a lot. Really. So just on a whim, somebody who I knew would be online and I knew would react to me, I shoot a mail out to Julian Bale, and I'm like, I am under the gun. Can I interview you? He's like, I feel weird about my English. I'm like, I feel weird about my English. Let's go, right? And so we just did it, and I didn't have any time to do any kind of quality edit on it or anything. And we just kind of talked about where he was coming from because I didn't have a chance to prepare any questions. So he just talked about where he came from and what he was doing and how how hard he worked to get the expertise in the things that he was into. I went back and I listened to it, and I'm like, I'm not going to edit a thing. I'm not going to edit out the hems and haws because I don't have much time, but it doesn't matter because all of a sudden this came across as really human, right? And instead of being an interview, it was a discussion. I was really caught by that. And that was something that, at that point, I stopped preparing questions. And instead,
I think that's the thing that your podcast, to me anyway, fairly consistently delivers. First, if there are people that I know, I always discover something I'm surprised about. But moreover, it's really difficult to leave almost any podcast you've ever done and not have a sense that you know something about the person you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And the other thing that I realized is by not having prepared questions, I was put into a position of having to listen very closely to what people were saying. Where if I've got a list, I mean, and you see this when you see people interviewed on TV or whatever, right? The interviewer will ask a question, and the person starts asking it, and you see the interviewer looking down at his notes and checking off, yep, I asked this question, and stuff like that. And you realize, oh, someone prepared a list of questions. They could care less what this person says in the interview, right? Well, I realized I'm talking to all these people, many of which I would claim to be sort of my heroes. I got to do more than just look at my piece of paper with my questions, right? I have to engage with them because they're going to talk about stuff that I'm into anyway. So it's not like it's going to be hard to talk about it. That was a revelation. To do that was a big, big deal. That changed the tone of the podcast and made it what I think is a much... It turned it to me from being a podcast into kind of an oral history thing. And so that's kind of... When I really think about it, I think that the legacy of the podcast is actually that it captures the oral history of a time in a certain kind of artwork.
I think that's entirely fair. The other thing that you're being really self-effacing about, and sitting here in front of the microphone on this end of things, it's really complicated to actually only have one question and then try to figure out how to listen and to follow a story. Because my discussion with you has twisted in ways I would never have imagined in a billion years. It's a little scary.
Sure, right. Well, but there again, isn't that just the case with humans in general? Isn't that the case with everybody that you know? The more you know about them, the more fascinating they are. The more you know about them, the more you want to know about them.
Yeah,
I think in a way it's why I try to never call these interviews, because the last thing I want is for these to be interviews. I want them to be a discussion about a person's life.
And here's the other thing that I think, not to spend all of my time praising the program now that we're on this line of questioning, but here's one of the other things that I think is really interesting about the work that you've done, and that is you get people to talk about things that they loved.
Yeah.
And you've also been really generous about allowing them to proceed in some off direction in the name of talking about the thing they love.
I interview very few politicians because I'm not interested in what they do, right? I'm not interested in, I probably wouldn't do a promoter, right? Because even though a promoter works in the area of media arts and stuff like that, I'm not really interested in what they do because to a large extent it seems like a glorified party planner. Now I know promoters would beat me up for saying that, but I have trouble imagining myself being interested. Now, the fact is, some people like this Mother sound system, I would love to hear the process they put together to make this very personal and unique experience, right? I don't really want to know about the guy who puts together Coachella because I don't care. I have the luxury of picking the people I'm going to talk to. So that helps a lot, right? I pick people that are interesting to me. I'm interested in what academics do because teaching this stuff to people and teaching the next generation of people that are going to make the music I love, that's pretty interesting. Or teaching the people who are going to be setting off on the brave new world of video artwork in the 21st century. That's amazing to me, and I love hearing about it. I love knowing about it. I love knowing what artists do and how they do the things they do. I love hearing about inventors that build a thing. All that stuff is really interesting to me. So I luxuriate in my ability to choose who I'm going to talk to.
There's a real sense in which, to me, I'm thinking about your idea of the podcast as a snapshot of a time. The thing that's interesting about that comment to me is that I think that's an emergent property.
Oh, sure.
You didn't start out thinking of yourself as a curator.
No, in fact, I would have never done it if I would have thought that was part of the job.
And actually, you might find curators sort of boring to talk to.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I recently interviewed Ben Griswold, and he does like design for museum pieces, right? And I'm not a designer. It kind of makes me a little scared to even think. I don't want him to say, well, as I'm sure you learned in first year art, the Bloody is ever present in our work, and I would be like, yes, sir, what you said. But I mean, it is interesting. I mean, some of this stuff is kind of interesting. A big part of it, though, too, is you notice I very seldom ask people to tell me about, like, what are the best examples of the thing you do, because that ends up being really too tightly aligned to me being, I would have to be interested in the subject to know that, right?
Yeah.
Where in
You're right. I don't think I can remember you ever asking somebody that kind of question.
Well, because if for no other reason, I mean, my tastes change too. So, for example, I may not like a certain artist's current output, but that doesn't mean that their work isn't important or timely or part of our milieu. It's just I personally don't happen to like some of their content right now. That doesn't mean I don't want to know about how they became an artist or how they did work that I liked before, or maybe I would find out that 6 months from now I'd grow enough so that I really like their work that they're doing right now, And so I don't want to be pejorative about anything because my taste changes rapidly. I want to be able to kind of go with that flow, but also not always assume that where my head is at today is truth, right? I just like thinking that I'm part of a continuous flow, that everything around me is emergent, so I need to be as well. And there you go. That's at least part of my story. I hope that you found it interesting. Thanks a lot to Gregory Taylor for both pushing me into doing this, as well as serving as the MC for the project. I want to thank everyone again for their support in the Kickstarter campaign, and also for their support in listening to this podcast. Number 100. I can't believe it's here. But there you go. Number 101 starts next week. I hope that you'll tune in again, and thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.